The air in the television studio was thick and warm, smelling faintly of hairspray, electricity, and something else, something metallic and artificial that she couldn't quite place. It was a world away from the scent of fresh-cut hay and damp earth that she was used to. From her position just behind the heavy velvet curtains, she could hear the muffled roar of the crowd, a living, breathing beast of sound that seemed to shake the very floor beneath her worn-out sneakers. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild bird trying to break free. She took a deep, shaky breath, the kind you try to take when you're about to do something terrifying, like jump into a cold lake or tell a hard truth. This felt like both. A stagehand with a headset and a serious face gave her a quick nod. "You're on in 5, he mumbled, not even looking at her, his attention already on the next task, the next person. To him, she was just another contestant, another number in the long line of hopefuls who would pass through these doors. She smoothed down the front of her dress. It was a simple, sky-blue cotton dress that her mother had helped her sew. It was clean and neat, but here, under the harsh glare of the backstage lights, it felt plain, almost childish. She had seen the other contestants, shimmering in fabrics that caught the light like liquid metal, their hair styled into elaborate sculptures, their faces painted with confidence. She felt like a wild flower that had been mistakenly planted in a perfectly manicured garden of roses. And now, a booming voice echoed from the stage, the voice of the host. A man with teeth so white they seemed to have their own light source. "Let's give a warm welcome to our next hopeful. All the way from the small town of Oakhaven, please welcome El-Ra." The curtains parted. The wall of sound hit her first, 1,000 clapping hands that weren't really for her, not yet. It was just a polite, obligatory noise. She walked forward, her sneakers squeaking softly on the glossy black floor. The studio was bigger than she had ever imagined, a cavern of darkness dotted with tiny, blinking red lights from the cameras. They looked like 100 unblinking eyes, all staring right at her. In front of her, a long table was set up, and behind it sat the 3 judges. They were like characters from a different planet. The one in the middle was the famous music producer, a man known for his scathing reviews and his ability to make or break a career with a single sentence. He was leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed, his expression one of bored amusement. He had seen it all, and she was just another act. To his left sat the pop star, a woman who had sold millions of records with songs about heartbreak and partying in the city. She offered El-Ra a small, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And on the right was the comedian, known for his quick wit and even quicker judgments. He was already fiddling with his pen, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else. They were a trinity of modern-day royalty. She was a peasant who had stumbled into their court. She reached the center of the stage, the designated spot, and stood there for a moment, feeling incredibly small and exposed. The host's voice was beside her again, smooth and slick. "So, El-Ra, it's quite a journey from Oakhaven to our stage. Tell everyone a little bit about yourself." She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry as a bone. She brought the microphone closer to her lips, her hand trembling just a little. "Well," she began, her voice softer than she wanted it to be, a little shaky. I live on a farm with my family. We grow corn and soybeans mostly, and I help out with everything." A few light chuckles rippled through the audience. They weren't mean chuckles, but they were the kind of laughs you give a child who says something cute and naive. She felt her cheeks flush with heat. "Sounds like a hard-working life," the host said, his tone dripping with a kind of patronizing charm. "And what do you do for fun out there in Oakhaven?" "I sing," she said, a little more firmly this time. "I sing in our church choir, and sometimes I just sing in the barn. The acoustics are really good in there." Another slightly louder wave of amusement went through the crowd. The music producer let out an audible sigh and checked his watch. The pop star gave her a look that was a mix of pity and curiosity. Singing in a barn. It was the kind of detail that painted a perfect, simple, and utterly unimpressive picture. They expected something easy, a folk song maybe, a sweet, slightly off-key rendition of an old hymn, something wholesome and forgettable. They were ready to pat her on the head, say good for you, and send her on her way. But as she stood there, under the crushing weight of their low expectations, something shifted inside her. She thought about the countless mornings she had spent waking up before the sun, the air cold and crisp, to feed the chickens and milk the cows. She thought about the long, hot afternoons on a tractor, the endless rows of corn stretching out to the horizon, a silent green ocean. She thought about the evenings, sitting on the porch swing with her grandfather, listening to the crickets sing their loud, rhythmic song. He was the one who had first told her she had a gift. "You've got a voice, Alara," he used to say, his old eyes twinkling. "It's not just for the chickens and the Lord. That voice is meant for bigger barns." This was the biggest barn she had ever seen. And she wasn't here to be cute. She wasn't here to be a simple, wholesome story for them to enjoy and forget. She was here because of a promise she had made to herself and to the memory of her grandfather. She was here to show them that the quietest places can hold the loudest storms, that the simplest-looking seeds can grow the most extraordinary flowers. The nervousness was still there, a hum under her skin, but now it was joined by something else, a flicker of determination, spark of defiance. The host finished his scripted questions and moved back to his position off stage, leaving her alone in the center of the circle of light. The music producer leaned forward, his expression still skeptical. "All right, Alara, the stage is yours. What are you going to sing for us today?" He asked the question, as if he already knew the answer, as if it was just a formality before the inevitable. She looked out at the three judges, at the sea of anonymous faces in the dark, at the unblinking red eyes of the cameras. She took one last, deep breath, this one not shaky, but full and steady. She was no longer just a girl from a small town. She was a singer. She was about to show them what that really meant. The polite, expectant silence in the room was about to be broken. The producer leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished surface of the judge's table. The studio lights caught the expensive sheen of his suit jacket, making him look like a sleek, modern predator. He steepled his fingers, his eyes narrowing slightly as they scanned her from her simple shoes to her unadorned hair. A small, almost invisible smile played on his lips. It was the look of a man who had seen thousands of hopefuls just like her. A look that said, "Impress me, I dare you." His voice, when it came, was smooth and carried icily across the silent studio. But it was laced with a thick layer of condescension. "All right. Ilara," he began, drawing her name out just a little too long. "The stage is yours. We're all very intrigued." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. The audience chuckled, knowing exactly what he meant. "So tell us, what are you going to sing for us today? Something nice and simple from back home? A little folk song, perhaps?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. In that moment, 1,000 different songs flashed through her mind. Safe songs, easy songs, songs her mother taught her, songs that wouldn't require much, songs that would let her get through this with a little bit of dignity and a polite, pitying applause. She could see the path clearly. Sing a simple tune, get a few kind words from the pop star judge, sarcastic comment from the comedian, and a dismissive wave from the producer. Then she would go home, back to the farm. And this whole strange dream would be over. But then another memory surfaced, cutting through the fog of her fear like a sharp, clear beam of sunlight. It was a memory of a cold autumn afternoon, years ago. She was just a little girl, sitting on the worn, floral-patterned rug in their small living room. Her grandfather had brought out an old, dusty record player, a machine that looked like a piece of ancient furniture. He carefully placed a black vinyl disc on the turntable, gently lowering the needle. A crackle filled the room, and then a voice came through the speakers. It was a woman's voice, but it was more than just a voice. It was a force of nature. It soared and dipped. It was delicate one moment and thunderous the next. It was filled with a joy and a longing that she didn't understand but could feel deep in her bones. She remembered looking up at her grandfather, her eyes wide with wonder. "What is that, Grandpa?" she had whispered. He had smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That, my little sparrow," he said, "is opera. It's when a human heart gets so full of feeling that it can't be held in anymore. It has to fly out." The memory was so vivid, so real. She could almost smell the old wood smoke from the fireplace and feel the scratchy wool of the rug against her hands. Her grandfather's belief in her had been a constant, quiet presence in her life. He was the one who had told her she had a gift, the one who had encouraged her to sing not just in the church, but for herself, for the joy of it. He had passed away last winter, but his voice was still with her, a steady guide in the confusing darkness. He wouldn't want her to play it safe. He would want her to let her heart fly. The nervousness in her stomach didn't disappear, but it changed. It was no longer a cold, paralyzing fear. It transformed into a hot, buzzing energy like a current running through her veins. She looked directly at the producer, meeting his gaze for the first time. Her grip on the microphone stand loosened. She stood up a little straighter. The silence in the studio stretched, becoming heavy with anticipation. The audience shifted in their seats, waiting for the simple, predictable answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I will be singing the Jewel song from the opera Faust." The name of the song landed in the middle of the studio with the force of a dropped stone. For a split second, there was nothing but absolute silence. It was as if the entire room had to take a moment to process what she had just said. Then, a low murmur began to ripple through the audience. It wasn't a murmur of excitement, but of confusion and disbelief. People started turning to their neighbors, whispering behind their hands. "Did she say what I think she said? The Jewel song. Is she kidding? Oh, this is going to be a disaster." As the sound grew, a wave of pity and morbid curiosity that washed over the stage. The reaction at the judges' table was even more pronounced. The producer's small, condescending smile bloomed into a full-blown smirk of pure, unadulterated amusement. He let out a short, sharp laugh and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He looked like a man who had just been handed a ticket to the most spectacular show in town, a car crash in slow motion. He couldn't wait to see her fail. The pop star judge, on the other hand, winced. A genuine look of pain and sympathy crossed her face. She knew better than anyone the immense technical difficulty of that piece. It was a song that required years of classical training, a powerful vocal range, and a mastery of control that took most singers a lifetime to achieve. Seeing this small, nervous girl from a farm choose that song was like watching a toddler decide to wrestle a grizzly bear. She slowly shook her head, almost imperceptibly. A silent prayer for the poor girl on stage. Even the comedian judge stopped fiddling with his pen. He turned to the pop star and whispered something that made her frown. He then looked back at Alara, his expression a mixture of shock and a kind of professional awe at the sheer audacity of her choice. The host, sensing that the moment was spiraling out of his control, stepped back in with a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Wow, the Jewel song. Now that is a very ambitious choice, Alara. A real big city choice." He was trying to frame it as a positive, but his tone betrayed his own disbelief. He was trying to save her, to give her an out, but she didn't take it. Alara just stood there, a small island of calm in the middle of a sea of skepticism. She had made her choice. There was no going back now. A strange sense of peace settled over her. The worst part was over the decision. Now all she had to do was sing. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the conductor. A man with silver hair and a serious face who had been watching the entire exchange from his podium. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then he looked down at his sheet music. He had prepared for a simple folk song, not this. But he was a professional. He raised his baton. The studio lights felt hotter than ever. The murmurs from the audience died down, replaced by a tense, expectant hush. Every eye was on her. The judges were poised, their pens ready, their expressions set. They were waiting for the first wrong note, the first crack in her voice. They expected a train wreck, and they had front-row seats. Alara took one last deep breath, filling her lungs with the warm, artificial air of the studio. She closed her eyes, shutting out the lights, the cameras, and the doubting faces. In the darkness behind her eyelids, there was only her. The memory of her grandfather's smile, and the music that was about to fly. The conductor's baton rose, a thin white stick against the vast darkness of the studio. For a moment, it hung in the air, a silent command. Every eye in the room was fixed on it, and then on the girl standing alone in the circle of light. The producer had a look of eager, almost cruel anticipation on his face, like someone who has just placed a large bet on a sure thing. The audience was a coiled spring of pity and morbid curiosity. They were braced for it, for the crack, the squeak, the inevitable, embarrassing failure that would confirm all their first impressions. Then, the baton came down. The first notes from the grand piano were delicate and precise, like drops of water falling into a still pool. They were the opening of the aria, a simple, hesitant melody that was meant to represent a young woman's first glimpse of something beautiful and dazzling. It was the calm before the storm. As the last note of the introduction faded, a silence fell over the studio, so complete and so heavy that you could almost hear the collective intake of breath. This was it. The moment of truth. Ilara opened her mouth. What came out was not the shaky, timid voice they had heard during the interview. It was not the off-key warble they were expecting. The first note that emerged was a single, clear sound like a small silver bell being struck in a quiet room. It was pure, it was perfectly in tune, and it carried to the very back of the vast studio without any effort at all. It hung in the air, shimmering for a moment, and then was followed by the next note and the next. Each one as perfect and as clear as the last. A ripple of something that wasn't quite confusion and wasn't quite surprise went through the audience. It was the sound of 100 people thinking, wait a minute. At the judges' table, the producer's smirk faltered. He leaned forward slightly, his head cocked to one side, his expression changing from amused cynicism to intense analytical curiosity. The pop star judge's look of pity had vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed, focused stare. She was a professional. She recognized quality when she heard it. But it wasn't just the technical perfection that was holding them captive. It was the feeling in the voice. As Ilara sang the opening phrases, her entire demeanor began to change. The nervous girl who was clutching the microphone stand for dear life seemed to be melting away. Her shoulders, which had been hunched with tension, began to relax. Her grip on the stand loosened. Her eyes, which had been darting around the room in fear, were now closed, as if she were blocking out the entire world and retreating into the music. She was no longer just standing on a stage in a television studio. In her mind, she was back in her grandfather's living room, listening to that old record. She was remembering the feeling of wonder she had felt hearing that powerful, beautiful voice for the first time. She was channeling that same feeling, that same sense of discovery and awe. The song was about a woman named Marguerite who has just been given a box of jewels and is marveling at their beauty. And in that moment, Ilara understood her. She knew what it was like to find something unexpectedly beautiful in a simple world. She had found it in a perfect, smooth stone in the creek bed, in the way the sun caught the wings of a dragonfly, in the intricate patterns of a spider's web glistening with morning dew. She was singing about jewels, but she was singing about those small, perfect moments. 2. The music began to grow more complex. A quick, fluttering run of notes came up, a passage that was a notorious trap for even experienced singers. It required incredible agility and control. The audience, who had now fallen into a hushed, reverent silence, held its collective breath. The producer's pen was frozen halfway to his notepad. The comedian judge had completely forgotten he was on a television show. He was just a man, listening to a beautiful song. Ilara navigated the run of notes with an effortlessness that was breathtaking. It was like watching a bird soar through a complicated forest, dipping and diving with an innate, unthinking grace. There was no strain in her voice, no hint of difficulty. It was as natural to her as breathing. When she hit the final high note of the phrase and held it, the sound seemed to expand, filling every corner of the studio. It wasn't loud, but it was immensely powerful, current of pure sound that washed over everyone. This was the moment the tide turned completely. The skepticism was gone. The pity was gone. All that was left was pure, unadulterated astonishment. The producer slowly put his pen down, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. He was no longer watching a contestant. He was witnessing a phenomenon. The pop star judge had a hand over her mouth, her eyes shining with tears. She was not just hearing a singer. She was hearing a kindred spirit, someone who understood the deep, soul-altering power of music. The transformation of Ilara was complete. The girl from the farm was gone. In her place stood a performer, an artist, a woman completely in command of her gift. The simple blue dress no longer looked plain. It looked like the costume of a storybook princess who had disguised herself as a peasant. The worn-out sneakers were forgotten. All anyone could see was the expression on her face, a look of serene, joyful concentration. She wasn't thinking about the judges or the cameras or the millions of people watching at home. She was living inside the song. The music was her world, and her voice was the only thing that existed in it. She had taken their low expectations, their polite, pitying applause, their cynical smirks, and she had turned them into something else entirely. She had turned them into silence. A profound, mesmerized, and utterly captivated silence. And she was just getting started. The music swelled, rising from the delicate, shimmering notes of the opening into a richer, more complex melody. The orchestra, now fully engaged, wove a tapestry of sound around her voice. A golden thread running through a magnificent fabric. Ilara was no longer just singing the notes. She was living inside them. The shy girl from the farm had been completely replaced by a woman who was channeling a century of emotion. A story of wonder and desire that was as old as time itself. The aria began its ascent, climbing towards its first major peak. The melody grew bolder, more demanding. It was a musical mountain, and she was scaling it with an exhilarating, fearless grace. The producer, the man who had built a career on finding the next big thing, found himself leaning so far forward in his chair, he was in danger of falling out. His mind, a calculator that usually ran on profit margins and marketability, had gone completely silent. He wasn't thinking about contracts or record sales. He was feeling the power in that voice, a raw, untamed power that couldn't be taught or manufactured. It was a force of nature, like a river that had carved its own path through a mountain. He saw the other judges out of the corner of his eye. The pop star was crying, silent tears tracing paths down her perfectly made-up cheeks. The comedian was just staring, his mouth slightly open, his witty retorts and sarcastic comments forgotten. Buried somewhere under an avalanche of pure, unadulterated awe, but the most profound change was happening in the audience. The sea of faces, once a blur of polite disinterest, was now a collection of individual, deeply human stories. A young woman in the front row, who had been checking her phone just minutes before, was now staring at the stage, her own hand resting on her heart as if to keep it from beating out of her chest. An old man, who had come with his granddaughter, had removed his glasses and was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. A couple in the back who had been whispering to each other were now holding hands. Their fingers intertwined, their eyes locked on the small figure on the stage. They weren't just watching a performance anymore. They were part of it. Her voice was reaching into each of them, finding something familiar, something personal, pulling it to the surface. Ilara felt none of this. In her mind, the studio, the cameras, the judges, and the crowd had all dissolved. She was standing in a sun-drenched field behind her house, the tall corn rustling in the breeze. She was singing for the sky, for the earth, for the memory of her grandfather. She remembered him telling her, "Music isn't about the notes on the page, little sparrow. It's about the space between the notes. It's about the silence." She understood. The power wasn't just in the sound she was making, but in the emotion that filled the quiet moments, the anticipation that hung in the air before a difficult passage, the breath she took before a soaring high note. The music pushed higher, into a stratosphere of sound that few singers ever dare to explore. This was the part of the aria that separated the good from the great, the amateurs from the artists. It was a series of rapid, glittering high notes, a vocal fireworks display that required not just power but incredible precision and control. The conductor, a man who had led orchestras in the world's greatest concert halls, was watching her with an expression of intense concentration. He was with her every step of the way, his baton guiding the orchestra to follow her, to support her, to stay out of her way and let her fly, and fly she did. The notes poured out of her, not as strained, forced shouts, but as effortless cascading streams of crystal-clear sound. It was as if her throat was not a human instrument, but something magical. A flute carved by a master craftsman from a branch of a mythical tree. The sound was so pure, so perfect, that it seemed to defy the laws of physics. It didn't just fill the room. It seemed to change the very air in it, making it feel lighter, cleaner. Charged with an electric energy then, the music shifted again. The technical fireworks subsided, and the melody became deeply, heartbreakingly beautiful. This was the emotional core of the piece. The moment where the character of Marguerite is overwhelmed by a mix of joy and a strange, sad foreboding. And Alara, drawing from a well of emotion she didn't even know she possessed, poured all of herself into it. She thought about the loneliness of the farm, the long, quiet nights. She thought about the joy of a simple harvest, the pride in her father's eyes. She thought about the deep, aching loss of her grandfather, the hole in her life that could never be filled. All of it, the joy and the sorrow, the hope and the fear, was channeled into her voice. The sound that came out was no longer just beautiful. It was real. It was the sound of a human heart laid bare for the entire world to see. It was a sound that could make you remember your first love, your greatest loss, your most cherished dream. It was a sound that could break your heart and put it back together again, all in the same breath. The producer, the cynic, the man of stone, felt a single, hot tear escape his eye and trace a path down his cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. He couldn't. He was frozen, captivated, completely and utterly defeated by the sheer, overwhelming beauty of what he was hearing. He had spent his entire life looking for talent, for that it factor, and he had finally found it. He had found it in a girl, in a simple blue dress, from a town he had never heard of, singing a song he had heard 100 times but had never truly understood until now. The music built one last time, rising towards the final, triumphant climax. The orchestra swelled, the drums rolled, and Alara's voice soared above it all, a beacon of pure radiant sound. She held the final note, a long, sustained, impossibly perfect note that seemed to hang in the air like a star. It was a note of victory, of defiance, of a soul that had finally found its voice and was shouting it to the heavens. And then, as the orchestra crashed to a final dramatic chord, she let it go. The silence that followed was the most powerful sound in the world. It was a heavy, sacred, absolute silence. No one moved. No one spoke. No one breathed. It was as if the entire world had stopped to listen to the echo of that final note, to let the beauty of what they had just experienced settle into their souls. The three judges were frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock, wonder, and profound life-changing emotion. The audience was a statue garden of stunned faces. The red lights on the cameras continued to blink, recording a silence that was more eloquent than any words could ever be. In that single, breathtaking moment, a small-town girl with a big voice didn't just sing a song. She changed everything.